In today's video, we're going to be looking at how we can prompt players to favorite our game, as well as reward them for doing that. Now, before we begin, in order to save us a lot of time, we're actually going to be starting off by using my own personal game template, which I'll leave a link down below in the description to. Once you visit this link on the game page, you're able to click the three dots right here and then click Edit in Studio. And then that should open up the game directly inside of Roblox Studio for you. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this game template, essentially it includes the module framework, which allows us to write all of our logic inside of module scripts, a UI scaling script, which will automatically scale UIs to all device sizes, the profile service for easily managing and handling players' data, and maybe one or two other libraries, which just makes creating our games significantly easier. Now, even if you're completely unaware of what any of those systems are, none of those are very important to this episode, but if you're wanting to learn more about those systems, I'll leave a link down below in the description to about a 3-part series where you can learn all the specifics about each of those systems. So feel free to go ahead and check those out once you're finished this video. What we're first going to work on is creating a part inside of our game, which will tell the player, hey, come over here, favorite our game to earn some coins, and then we'll also create another part, which will actually be the part that the players need to step on to be prompted to favorite the game and receive their reward. And keep in mind, these parts aren't going to look great. They're not meant to be used in actual full release games. They're literally just for demonstration purposes to quickly show you guys how to do this. So inside of your workspace, we're going to go ahead and create a part. We'll go ahead and just resize this part real fast. So just make it a little bit taller and then make it a little bit wider. Doesn't really matter. Move it over. Then we'll go ahead and rename this part to be called sign. My OCD is kind of making me move it down so it's actually touching the ground. Anyway, we want to set the anchor property to true so that it does not move. Then what we're going to do is go ahead and duplicate this part, and we'll rename this other part to be called touch, as this is supposed to be the part which the player can step on and touch to be prompted to favorite our game. Then let's just go ahead and resize this a little bit. So I'll move it as well and then just resize it again. So that works perfectly fine. Then what we're going to do is just go ahead and change the color of this to actually be green so that we can easily see the difference between the two parts. Then we're going to go ahead and select both of these parts. You can select multiple objects inside your Explorer by holding down the Control or Shift key. And once you have them selected, go ahead and right click them and then click on Group as Model, which will just literally create a model and then insert them inside of there. That's all that this actually does. Then what we're going to do is rename this model to be called Favorite Sign. It's not a great sign, but I'm going to go ahead and call it a sign. And make sure that you either spell everything correctly the same way that I do, or if you do spell it differently, make sure that you also keep that in mind, because when it comes to scripting, you may face some errors if the spelling is differently and you don't correct that while we're scripting. Next, what we're going to do is inside of the sign, let's go ahead and add in a service GUI. And then to the service GUI, we're going to go ahead and add in a text label. Now, for the size of this text label, it literally doesn't matter. We're just going to say 1,1, so that's the entire width and height. Then for the actual text of this, let's go ahead and say something like favorite the game for 100,000 coins. Then we're going to go ahead and change the font to Frodoka 1 to make it look a little bit better. And then let's go ahead and increase the text size a little bit. Okay, now with that being said, this UI is looking beautiful. So I think we're honestly kind of finished with creating this entire sign as well as the GUI. Now, yes, I understand this looks terrible, but again, this little part right here is not the point of the video at all. It's just literally visual elements to help us test this logic out and see it right in front of us. So now that we've done all of that, the next thing that we're going to do is actually begin scripting. And when it comes to scripting, a lot of the logic that we're going to write is actually going to be on the client side, because it turns out that from the server side, you're not actually able to check if a player has favorited your game or even prompt the player to favorite your game neither. So literally all of that has to be handled on the client side. And when it comes to the server side, there's really not much that we're actually going to do. And you'll see exactly what I mean in just a second. Now, to quickly explain how this is going to work, basically, a player is going to come up and touch this green part right here. When they touch this part, what's going to happen is we're going to check if the player has already favorited the game or not. Because if the player has already favorited the game, then we don't need to reward them a second time. But if the player has not favorited our game, then we're going to go ahead and prompt them to favorite our game. Now, how can we tell if the player has favorited our game? Well, what we're going to do is actually store this inside of the player's data. So we're going to go ahead and update the player's data. And then, like I said, if the player has not already favorited the game, we're going to go ahead and prompt them to favorite the game. And remember, all of this is being done on the client side. Then, once the player has responded to the prompt by either clicking favorite or don't favorite, we can listen to the result of that event on the client side. And if the player did favorite the game, what we're going to do is use a remote event to communicate from the client to the server to tell the server, hey, I just favorited the game. Go ahead and update my player data to say that I have favorited the game, and then also give me my rewards as well. So now that we have a basic understanding of how the system's going to work, you might be thinking, well, since all of that's being done on the client side, is this even secure to do? And I think that's definitely a valid concern. To be completely fair, the way that this is handled means that this is not secured at all. And what I mean by that is if an exploiter joins your game, all they would have to do is literally fire off the remote event for the server to assume that they have favored our game. And while I understand that might scare some of you guys away, let me say two things. One, I think this should definitely be more secure and actually possible to be done from the server side, but that's up to Roblox to make possible. And number two, I would say that there is a lot of things to worry about when it comes to exploiters, but as long as you're not placing something super valuable behind favoriting your game, I don't think it's worth worrying about at all, unless for some reason you're storing some really big, impactful rewards behind this. Because at the end of the day, I think it's just kind of a good way of encouraging players to favor your game, which theoretically should help your game grow. And in the worst case scenario, what's happening? Maybe you're giving a handful of players some free rewards. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it, and that's the full disclosure. If you're interested in making this system, then feel free to continue following through the video, and because that's what we're just about to do. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and update the player's data. To do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage and go ahead and open up the player data module script. Now the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and update the type. So after gems, we're going to go ahead and add in another key value pair to this, which is going to be called has favorited, and that is going to be a boolean. Then let's go ahead and update the default player data variable. We'll go ahead and add in has favorited, and we're going to go ahead and set that to false by default, because when the player joins the game for the first time, they definitely have not favorited it. Now that's actually all that we have to do inside of the player data module, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Since we've updated the player's data, we also need to update the state manager as well, which is how we handle and modify the player's data. So to do this, what we're going to do is go inside of the functions folder and open up the update state module script. And the first thing we want to do is go ahead and add in a brand new state action. So we'll go ahead and update this. We'll go ahead and create another table below this. For the action, we're going to go ahead and call this favorite game. And that's actually the only key value pair that this action is going to have, because we really don't need any other arguments or information. All we need to know is that this action has actually been ran. So then let's go ahead and update the function, which is where we actually manipulate or modify the player's data. We'll go ahead and say else if action.action equals. And now if the action equals favorite game, then what do we want to do? Well, we're going to go inside of the player data, and then we'll go ahead and update the has favorited key value pair and set that to true. Because whenever this action is called, that means that the player has actually favorited the game. So we'll update their data to reflect that. And that's all that we're going to do inside of this module script, so we can go ahead and close out of that as well. Now, we're fully finished inside of the replicated storage, so we can go ahead and collapse that. And we're going to kind of work backwards a little bit, because I think it might be simpler this way, even though it might be kind of slightly less intuitive. Actually, I almost forgot, we need to do one more thing inside the replicated storage, and that is create the remote event. So inside the remotes folder, we're going to go ahead and add in a brand new remote event, which we'll rename to be called favorite game. And of course, we'll go ahead and use this remote event from the client side to communicate to the server side that the player has favorited the game. So now we are finished with replicated storage, and now we'll go ahead and start scripting this on the server side. So inside of the server script service, we're going to want to go ahead and open up the services folder, and then we're going to go ahead and create a brand new module script inside of here, which we're going to go ahead and call favorite service. Then of course inside of here, we'll go ahead and create our local variable as well as our shared variable, and then we'll go ahead and return the shared variable. Now, towards the top of our script, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the replicated storage. So we'll say game get service replicated storage, and then we'll of course also name our variable that as well. Then what we're going to want to do is create a variable for the player data service. So we'll say player data service equals require script.parent.player data service, just like that. And then we also want to create a variable for the remotes folder, which is inside of the replicated storage. Cool. So now what we want to do is go ahead and create the onStart function. So we'll go ahead and create a brand new function, which is going to be part of the shared table, and we're going to go ahead and call that onStart. Of course, because of the module framework, this function is going to be ran when the game starts up for the first time, and this script is required automatically. And when the script starts up, what we want to do is listen to the favorite game remote event. So we're going to say remotes.favoriteGame.onServerEvent connect, and then we'll go ahead and connect that to the function that we're just about to create. So below the onStart function, we're going to create a brand new function, which is going to be part of the local table, and this is going to be called player favorited game. And it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the player who has favorited the game. Now, inside of this function, the first thing we want to do is go ahead and get the player state. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called state, which is going to be equal to player data service.getState, and then we'll go ahead and pass it to the player. If we do not get that state, then what we're going to do is say return n to stop the function right there. After that, we want to check if the player has already favorited the game. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called hasFavorite, which is going to be equal to state.hasFavorited. And you can rename this variable to end with a D to stay consistent. Now, if the player has already favorited the game, then what we're going to do is say return n to stop the function right there, because we don't want to reward the player twice. But now that we understand that the player has not already favorited the game previously, we can go ahead and update their data to say that they have favorited it, and then to also reward them as well. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called favorite action, which will specify the type of as player data service.state action, and we're going to set that equal to a table. And inside of this table, all we have to do is specify the action, which is favorite game. Then we can go ahead and use that action by using the player data service. We'll go ahead and call update state, pass through the player, and then also pass through the favorite action as well. Then beneath that, we want to go ahead and create another action, which is going to be called reward action. This again is going to be of the player data service.state action type, which will be equal to a table. And the action that we're going to use here is actually the update currency action. For the currency, we're going to go ahead and specify coins. And then for the amount, we're going to go ahead and say 100,000, just like that. Now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and use it right beneath it. So we'll go ahead and say player data service.update state, pass through the player, and then also pass through the reward action, just like that. And that's actually all that we have to do with this function. So let's go ahead and use this function, go back to the onStart function, and we'll go ahead and connect the favorite game remote event to this function that we just created. So we'll go ahead and say local.playerFavoriteGame, just like that. So now whenever the player does favorite the game, of course, we'll communicate that from the client to the server using that remote event. Then this function will be called. We'll update their state to reflect that they have favorited the game, and then we'll also reward them as well. Now that's actually all that we're going to do inside of this script. So we can go ahead and close out of that. And there's also one more little thing that we're going to do on the server side, which is unnecessary, but I think it'll give you good insight into another way of rewarding players for favoriting your game. Like for instance, if a player favorites your game, maybe you want to give them a reward, which will double the amount of coins that they passively receive. So to do this, we're going to go inside of the player data service module. Then what we're going to do is scroll all the way down to the onStart function, and towards the bottom of here is where we actually have a while true loop going. Now, inside of the for loop where we're iterating through all the players, the first thing we're going to do is actually go ahead and get the player state. So we'll say shared.getState and pass through the player. And now if we do not get the state, then what we're going to do is say continue n to iterate to the next player because this current player has no state. Then we're going to create a variable called hasFavorited, which is going to be equal to state.hasFavorited. And now if the player has favorited their game, instead of only giving them a single coin, we're going to go ahead and give them 2 coins. So we'll say if hasFavorited, then 2, else 1. So like I said, if the player has favorited the game, then they'll receive 2 coins, whereas all the normal players who have not favorited the game will only receive 1. So this is an example of a different way of rewarding players who have favorited your game. And with that being said, that's all that we have to do to implement this form of a reward. So we can go ahead and close out of this module script, and we're entirely finished with the server side of things. So we can go ahead and collapse the server script service because now we want to begin working on the client side. So to finish out this system, the last thing we need to do is go ahead and write all the logic on the client side. To do this, we'll go inside of the star player, inside of the star player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, and then we'll go ahead and create a brand new module script inside of here. Let's go ahead and rename this module script to be called favorite controller. And then of course, we'll go ahead and update the variable. We want our local variable, and of course we want the shared variable, ending that by returning the shared variable as well. Then towards the top of our script, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for a couple of different services. The first service that we're going to create a variable for is the avatar editor service. After that, we're going to need 4 other services. We also want the player service, the replicated storage, and finally the workspace service. Of course, make sure you update all of your variable names just like that. Then after that, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the state controller, which we can get that by saying require script.parent.stateController. And we also want to create a variable for the remotes folder, which is inside of the replicated storage, and that folder is called remotes. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the actual part which we want the players to touch in order to prompt them to favorite the game. So we'll go ahead and just call this touch part, and we'll specify the type of this variable to be a part because Roblox actually won't automatically sense that this is a part. The reason for that is because to get this part, what we're going to do is go inside of the workspace, and then we want to use the wait for child method because Roblox has enabled streaming by default. If you want to learn more about streaming, go ahead and look into the Roblox documentation about that. Basically, they automatically load and remove models from the workspace, which the player is not near to help free up some memory and different things like that. So that's why we have to use wait for child because we can't guarantee that this model is already loaded in. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and wait for a child called favorite sign. Then once we get that model, we also need to wait for a child inside of that as well, which is called touch. And actually, I think I might be wrong here. I just removed where we specified the type of this variable because it actually seems like Roblox is automatically able to determine that this is a part, which is great. I think for some reason when I was writing this out, it didn't seem like that was working, but hey, I'm happy to see that that's not the case. Now I've pretty much got all the variables that we need. One more variable that we're going to create, which will actually just make a part of the local table, which is going to be called is touch on cooldown, and we're going to set that to false by default. Basically, we're only creating this in order to prevent spamming the player constantly trying to prompt them whenever they touch this part. Anyways, with all that being said, we're going to go ahead and create our first function, which is going to be a part of the shared table, and it's going to be called onStart. Now, this is actually the only function that we're going to create inside of here because the logic for this really isn't too complicated. The first thing we want to do inside of this function is go ahead and get the player's state. We can do that by saying stateController.getState. Now, of course, if we don't get the player's state, then what we're going to do is return n to stop the function right there. Then we want to check if the player has already favored the game. So we'll create a variable called isFavorited, which is going to be equal to state.hasFavorited. And if the player has already favorited it, so if isFavorited, then what we're going to do is return n to stop the function right there because the player does not need to re-favorite the game. After that, we're going to go ahead and use the touch part variable and we'll listen for it to be touched. So we'll say .touched. We'll go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function, which for the parameter of the anonymous function will give us the other part, which has touched this part. Whenever the touch part is touched, the first thing we want to do is try to get the player from the other part's parent. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called player. We'll use the player service, then use the method getPlayerFromCharacter, and then we are going to go ahead and pass through other part.parent. Now, if we don't get the player, or if the player that we actually get does not equal this client, so players.localPlayer, then what we're going to do is say return n to stop the function right there because we only care about this part being touched by our client. Now that we know that our client is actually touching this, the next thing we want to do is make sure that we're not on cooldown. So we'll say if local.isTouch on cooldown, then what we're going to do is say return n to stop the function right there. Now that we know that it's not on cooldown, let's go ahead and actually put the player on cooldown. So we'll say local.isTouch on cooldown and we'll set that to true. Then we'll go ahead and take the player off cooldown after a little bit. So we'll say task.delay. We'll wait half a second and then we'll go ahead and create an anonymous function. And then what we're going to do is go ahead and reset the player's cooldown. So we'll say local.isTouch on cooldown and set that back to false. Then after that, we're still inside of the anonymous function that the touched event's connected to. What we're going to do is once again check if the player has favorited the game, because I know we do that up here, but remember, we only do this when the player joins the game for the first time. So let's say, for instance, that the player does favor the game after they've touched the part. If they touch the part again, we also want to check if they favored the game again, just to avoid prompting them to favorite it once again. So we'll go ahead and create another variable, which is going to be called the same thing, isFavorited. And what we're going to do is use the stateController.getState, and then we'll say .hasFavorited. Now, if the player has already favorited the game, then what we're going to do is say return n to stop the function right there. But now if we get this far down, we know that the player has not favorited the game, so we're going to want to go ahead and prompt them to favorite the game. And whenever we prompt the player to favorite the game, we're going to do that inside of a p call, just because there are some minor errors that it can throw. For instance, if we try to prompt the player to favor the game while they already have the prompt open, an error can be thrown. So it's just safe to wrap this inside of a p call. So we're going to go ahead and say p call. Then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And inside of this p call is where we actually want to go ahead and prompt the player to favorite the game. And we can do that by using the avatar editor service, because that gives us access to a method called promptSetFavorite. The first thing we need to pass through to this function is the item ID, which for games, that's actually the game's place ID. So we'll say game.placeID. Then we want to specify the avatar item type, which we can do by saying enum.avatar_item_type. And the avatar item type of this is actually an avatar asset. I know this seems a little weird, but this is how you do it. And then we're going to go ahead and pass through true to prompt the player to favorite or unfavorite the game. Cool. So now that's actually all we have to do inside of the anonymous function connected to when the touch part is actually touched, and that'll prompt the player to favorite the game. But now the next thing we want to do is actually listen for when that prompt has been responded to by the player. And we can do this by using the avatar editor service and listening to the prompt set favorite completed event. So we'll go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function, which will give us the result of how that prompt was responded to. Now the result can be three different things. So we'll say if result, and if as long as it doesn't equal this one result, then we're going to assume that the player has favorited the game. So to check the different type of enums that we have, we'll say enum.avatar_prompt_result. Then we say period, and now we see the three different results that we have. Now, the result will equal success if the player has favorited the game. But let's say the player has already favorited your game and they favorited it once again, that will actually return failed. Now, that's okay, but if the player declines to favorite your game, then the result will actually be permission denied. So that's why I'm saying as long as the result does not equal permission denied, then the player has more than likely favorited the game. And considering how technically insecure this is already, I'm perfectly fine with having it work this way, because at least at the end of the day, the player is definitely not getting screwed over. So now that we know that the player has favorited the game, what we're going to do is go ahead and communicate that to the server. And we can do that by using the favorite game remote event. So we'll go ahead and say fire server, just like that. Cool. And now that we've done all that, we're actually fully finished with scripting this entire thing. So we can close out of that, go into our game, and begin testing this out. So now that we're in our game, we can see that I'm starting off with barely any coins. And we can see that it's only increasing by 1 coin every single time. So let's go ahead and touch this part right here. It prompts me to favorite something. Do you want to add and then the name of my game to favorites? I'll go ahead and click yes. And then once I click yes, we can see that I've actually been instantly rewarded a bunch of coins. And we can also see that my coins are increasing by 2 instead of 1 now. Now, if I step on this part again, nothing's actually happening. So we know that I have actually favorited the game, and we can see that I've been rewarded for that, and I'm still being rewarded for that because we've implemented 2 different rewards. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit MonzterDev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.